Thank you for joining us today on this webinar, Why You Need a Crisis Communications Plan. With me today is Drew Sherpin. He's the Director of Strategy and Communications from Alchemy Communications. He has a strong background in communications and has held various positions in marketing and communications. This webinar is being recorded and we will send you a copy of the presentation. Thank you.
All that fun stuff. So today we're going to be talking about crisis communications. And essentially, it's kind of that first kind of foray or that understanding of why it's important to just start to think about the process of creating a crisis comms plan. And first and foremost, oftentimes we hear about creating plans or documents, and we always get this like, oh, it's just another thing I have to do. It's more work. It's it has to be this massive document of everything that can go wrong. What do we do? In some cases, that's true, but in others, even if you have a one pager of simple things to follow in the event of potential scenarios, it can go a long way in helping sort of preserve your reputation and kind of steer you through rocky sort of waters when times get tough. So before we get going here, I always kick off my presentations with a land acknowledgement. So in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, Alchemy Communications, as an inhabitant of Calgary, Alberta, honors and acknowledges Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We also acknowledge that the territory we work and live upon is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. For those who might be new to the presentations and the seminars and the sort of the stuff we do here, a little bit about Alchemy and a little bit about myself. So Alchemy Communications is a full service PR, crisis comms, and marketing firm based in Calgary. We do everything from, as I mentioned, creating social content to crisis communications planning to crisis communication support. You think of it, we've probably done it in some capacity. We work with some of the businesses we work with are a lot of nonprofit agencies, small to mid-sized businesses, municipalities, and basically anyone who's looking for that additional sort of support in the world of communications. Okay, so we're going to be holding questions till the end of the presentation. We're going to have a sort of a slide that kind of wraps up and summarizes, and we'll give you guys the chance to share your thoughts and ask any questions. But if there is anything that you want to kind of maybe save, you can throw it into the chat function of the webinar, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so just kind of building upon what I mentioned right off the bat about crisis communications. So what is crisis communications? Oftentimes we hear the word crisis comms and we instantly go to things of doom and gloom, like the worst case scenarios or things we see on the news, and it's usually in that vein. But it's so much more than that. There's things that can be sort of looked at in that crisis lens that might not be, that sexy news topic, but it could still impact your business or your industry. So it's just something that we need to be aware and mindful of. So basically, with crisis communications, when it's needed is when there's an unpredictable event or something has created a potential situation or impact that can erode an organization's trust within the public, within your customers, whoever that may be. So if you've kind of joined me in my previous webinars, I use the trust word a lot, and this is no exception. So damaged trust can really generate a number of negative outcomes when we talk about crisis communication scenarios. Some of those obviously are maybe loss of revenue, staff, reputation, or they can even threaten the actual existence of the organization, right? It all depends on sort of how we're judging and we're looking at that impact of the scenario. So crisis communications really acknowledges the way that the public takes in or perceives an event, whether it's positive, neutral, or negative. Those three sort of feelings or emotions, those are really the major contributing factors to whether the event will become a crisis and to what level that might be. So some specific examples of what a crisis scenario might be, sort of for the purposes of this discussion. I've listed a few here, and then there's ones that aren't listed that obviously can come up as we go along. But first and foremost, some of the ones that I've kind of pulled together here are obviously like product recall. So situations where there's defects in particular models that are maybe sold by your dealership. What does that mean, right? So it could quickly. I know it's more of a manufacturer, but even that being said, it does impact the dealerships as well and the dealers as well. So it affects the reputation, and then again potentially causing financial loss. And then in sort of the last kind of 4 points there, those are ones obviously natural disasters. If you're impacted, your community is impacted by floods, wildfires, things like that. What does that sort of look like from a business standpoint? Again, we'll be kind of getting into the points of a crisis plan and what to include that cover these types of scenarios. But these are just examples of some things that you might face. And even just thinking like those right off the bat, those don't seem as, you wouldn't probably think of, some of them you might, but some might not be seen as crisis situations, right? Negative social media campaigns against the individual or the organization. Maybe there's a disgruntled customers that they start some sort of viral thing or something that goes viral on social that either maybe criticizes the dealer or an individual. And then security breaches. Maybe there's customer data that was compromised or leaked. So that's one thing we can really key in on as we go through today's presentation, how to handle things like that. And then maybe just disruptions in supply chain, right? And then just economic impacts as well. So maybe there's shortage of certain parts or different delays in manufacturing. It could maybe impact the ability to deliver products on time. Maybe that's one of your key sort of features or things that you leverage, is always having that timeliness and that ability to deliver. Well, maybe there's something that's out of your hands that's impacting that. So what is that? When does that become? And again, with all of these sort of bullet points, when do these situations start to kind of create what we call a crisis? So how do we handle that? What are the expectations? How do we communicate? So when we look at sort of these scenarios and what a crisis situation is, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why do I need a plan? Can't we just handle this as situations come up? We never had a situation in X number of years. I don't think we really need that. It's always good to be prepared. So especially with the rise of social media and just the way information is spread and digested these days, anything and everyone can become what we say a source, right? So anything can be put out there, whether it's true or not. Given the speed of sort of the way we consume media, if you can't sort of respond immediately or have some sort of response or answer to a question, a comment, maybe a viral video, whatever it may be, you risk having the public really draw their own conclusions to certain scenarios. So that's, you'll see when the further we get in the presentation, the idea of being prepared, what that really means. It's not being prepared for, this will never happen. It's almost like, well, when it does happen, we're ready, right? Because you've maybe often heard the term, it's not if, it's when, and that's no different in crisis communication. So the more you can really be prepared to sort of have that response or even just that answering of that question or that query, it can help to go a long way to either mitigating the situation or shutting it down right from the get-go. So it's really about preparation, as mentioned. So you need to really be prepared to handle these situations and respond. So what does that look like? You need to be able and nimble to respond at, especially nowadays, that 24/7 rule, right? Not saying if you see something at 2 o'clock in the morning and you have to respond right away, but you should be aware that things can happen at any time. gone are the days of sort of like we'd see it on the news, or you'd kind of wait for the next news cycle for things to kind of get out there. Now it's at any given moment, something can happen. And then one thing that's really important as we kind of preface this whole presentation is that you can't control every aspect of a situation or a crisis. But what you can control is the way that you respond or react to that. And that's usually done in messaging. So you can manage your message and really lay the groundwork to be prepared in these situations. So whether it's going back to those list of potential scenarios, you can, when you're building out your plan, you can actually list those. So what do we do in the event of a disgruntled customer? What do we do in the event of recall? What do we do in the event of, we have to be evacuated? What do we do? What do we do? And this doesn't necessarily always have to be media stories either. Oftentimes we have different audiences that we need to communicate with. So, your staff, stakeholders, customers, internal, everything is all kind of built into that, what a crisis comms plan is. So we talked about sort of what is crisis communications. So what is the plan? There's no real clear-cut like guide on, okay, your plan has to be 25 pages or 150 pages or whatever it may be. What it really is, though, it's something that's structured in a way that fits your organization or your dealership, right? So the way you sort of build that is through research and understanding potential scenarios, what might happen. Oftentimes what I find people make mistakes with is they go, okay, we need a crisis communications plan, and then they start building out plans for, and this, not saying this could happen, but likelihood is lower. So they start building enough stuff like, what happens if there's a shooter or a mass casualty event? And okay, there might be, but let's start thinking about these scenarios that are more likely to happen, right? So the customer scenarios, the disgruntled customers, things like that. So the way we really look at building out that crisis communications plan is structuring it in a way that sort of effectively communicates with your audience, both internal and external, in the event of a potential emergency or crisis. So the real goal of this plan is to manage, mitigate, and lessen the impact of situations that could be deemed having a negative impact on the organization. And by negative impact, sort of on a few different ways. So could have a negative impact on their reputation, negative impact on the operations, and then a negative impact on the overall sort of well-being of the company. So well-being from a financial sort of state of affairs to even internally. So the well-being of employees, right? Morale, if there's certain events that are more directed at staff, how do we handle that? So it's just about research and understanding what we need to really be prepared for in any event. So as I mentioned before, it's not the aim of these plans isn't to scare people. It's really about understanding and being prepared. It's no different than having, like emergency response plan if you're working out in the field in certain situations, other industries, right? They have, what do we do in the event of fire, accidents, stuff like that. It's no different. It's just our sort of situations are based on words, right? Our communication and messages. So the key components of what makes sort of, these are the things that you really want to look at when you're building out your crisis communications plan. So these, you don't have to include all of them, but it's a good point to kind of, look at it and say, okay, we need to sort of, if we're not including it, well, why, right? So sometimes some of the things that might be harder to manage, especially, is when we start talking about, okay, well, who is going to be monitoring social, and who is going to be the spokesperson, and who's going to be providing this information. Sometimes it comes down to resources, right? You might just not have that number of people on the team or something like that. So in the plan, it's good to sort of identify that, and how do you handle that? Maybe something in your plan might be work with a communications agency to develop the media release or whatever, if that's your strategy, right? So the sort of the I'm going to run through each bullet point, but these are the things to really key in on when you're looking at building out your crisis communications plan. So risk assessment, this is what sort of I mentioned by identifying those potential scenarios that might happen, right? So these are those things that the crises that could likely impact your organization. And then when you're looking at that, and you don't have to do this all on your own either. You can, brainstorm with the rest of your staff, and then just say, like, what is more that what have you seen? What has happened in the past? So once you've sort of identified those potential scenarios, you should break them down against the severity and then the likelihood of each crisis, right? So if you notice that, we've seen a lot of people posting on social media, good, bad, indifferent. So maybe that's more likelihood of something happening on that is higher than, say, you know, uh, a mass shooter event or something like that, or a data breach, for example. So it's just about ranking and understanding the severity and likelihood of what might happen. The second point is that clear chain of command. So this is sort of looking at, okay, so we moved this scenario from the first point, this assessment is happening. What does that look like? Who is handling what? So it's really about sort of designating roles and responsibilities within your organization on who's handling things. So who's the person responsible for, contacting staff if it's more of a staff involved situation? What does that look like? So establish a clear chain of command for the decision making. Is who's the final approver for a message that maybe needs to go to customers? Let's use the example of a data breach, right? So who is approving that message, sending it out to your database of customers saying, look, we've been hacked, all your personal information is out there. What does that look like? So before we even go to that sort of that external communications, who's responsible sort of for digesting that message, getting it out there, and then what does that message look like, right? So what are the steps that go into building out that message? And that goes into that third point there of communication protocols. So it's good to get down on paper and define how this information will be shared internally and externally. Is it via email? Is it through, if you have all the contact information in an email database, do you send it out that way? What about scenarios that require maybe a little bit more communication? Do we have phone? Like, are we calling these people directly? What does that look like? Do we need to, bring everyone down depending on the scenario and the situation? What does that look like? So it's sort of outlining what communications look like. So email, phone call, in person are usually the ones that I start with, and then build it out that way. And then when you're looking at the communication side, it's, well, what are the protocols around communicating with employees, customers, media, and other stakeholders? One of the biggest things that I find is that, especially when dealing with media, is that, and some organizations are better at this than others, but there's always this confusion on who's saying what and who can talk to media and how do we handle a media call and all that stuff. So it's good to, in this plan, you could have protocols for what happens when media calls. So if you just have a sort of boilerplate message for all staff saying, in the event of media, you direct them to this person, or here's the message. And obviously there's ebbs and flows on things depending on the situation. But if you didn't have that written down, or you didn't have this sort of protocol, then it would lead more questions and more potential. You're creating the crisis, right? So an example of that, sort of in the media side of things, is if you didn't have sort of in your crisis plan what to do in the event of a media call, and the media either calls or just shows up, and your staff doesn't know what to do, and they start, asking someone, hey, I just saw this social post about, this situation. Is it, what's happening? Is it true? And if that person, there's a few different ways it could go. They could feel, oh, I'm just going to answer it because I know, or I have no clue, or they could be confronted. There's so many different things that can happen. right? So if you have this sort of this protocol or this process in place where you can say, okay, this is, and this goes back to the sort of that chain of command and who's responsible for what. So maybe you see there's a situation or scenario, you send out a message and saying, okay, we may get media on this. This is what we do. The likelihood of it escalating is a lot less than if you didn't have that in place at all. So this sort of goes to that, as I mentioned, having those sort of pre-approved messages in place. So the way those sort of evolve is through that assessment of the scenario. So if there's ways that we can, pre-write a lot of the content ahead of time, um, not saying you can get it all done, because obviously there's going to be details that you don't know, or you can't try and be generic about certain things. But if you can just have that pre-approved template that, okay, an example of that would be the scenario. This is what we know. This is what we're doing. Is essentially your easy, basic holding statement message is what we call it. So the way you can have that is you have it structured in a way that you just have to put in the important details that once a scenario develops, right? One thing that this really does is it ensures consistency in the messaging across all channels, all people, right? If you have something that's kind of that plug and play scenario where it's pre-written, pre-approved, you don't have to go through these, okay, how does this look? Are we going to say that? You've already done the work, right? So you're just putting in those additional details. When we kind of look at the messaging, and the reason behind why we're putting together this messaging is, well, what's the point of it? So who's getting it? So obviously it could be external, internal, key stakeholders. You should always pretty much guarantee that whatever message you send out has the chance to get picked up by media. So if that's the case, it's always good to have a media relations strategy or idea of how to handle that media component within your crisis comms plan, because that's a huge part of it. Because what can happen is that media involvement or media sort of speculation or even interviews can either make the situation escalate or can de-escalate it as well. So when we're looking at sort of the basics of a media relations strategy, the first and foremost thing that you want to figure out is who's the person that's speaking to media. So is it the owner? Is it the manager? Is it based on situation, right? If you find if it's more of a product thing, okay, well, who's best served in that realm? Who can speak to that? If it's more of that organizational as a whole, maybe it is owner, manager, operator. So it's always good to designate that and have that, written down. And then part of that idea of the strategy is training that person or the group of individuals on what to do in the event of media. And this, we can spend a whole other webinar or seminar on media training, but what it's doing is it's just preparing people in the event they have to do an interview, right? I think the biggest thing with media is that they get nervous. It's like, what do I have to say? And then when we're talking crisis, it's usually not a positive, so they're even more nervous around that. One thing that I find when I'm doing media training or even talking about media is that sometimes people, they get this feeling that they need to sound really smart or be like, I'm on TV. This is my time to shine, or I have to sound like the smartest person in the room, right? And sometimes that can go, it's a double-edged sword. You don't want to come across thinking that you don't know your stuff, but on the same hand, you don't want to say something that might not be accurate or can escalate the situation. So when we're looking at sort of the strategy around how we're handling media, it's always good to outline the approach of how we interact with media during a potential crisis. So who who is the spokesperson, and how do we handle media requests? If someone comes in, all staff should sort of know, okay, we got a media request, it goes to Dave or Joe or whoever, right? Kathleen, whatever it is. Not this, there should never be this scenario where it's like, I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to do it myself. Or another thing you can say is, I don't know what to do. And then what media can do, or anyone for that matter, it just, it goes back to that, the erosion of trust. It's like, well, they don't know what the heck's, they're not running a tight ship here, right? It's almost like they have no clue what's the gravity of this situation. So the more you can plan for things like that, the better. When we're looking at sort of the idea of monitoring, again, that's monitoring media, social. If you're doing a lot of social content, you're probably already keeping an eye on things, because that's usually how people communicate, right? With if there's customer feedback or questions, they usually send them through social channels. So you might even have some of these processes in place already. So it's maybe literally just copying, pasting, and then putting it in the plan, or just writing it out, right? Knowing, okay, well, so-and-so runs our social, they monitor it. Let's put that pen to paper and put it in the crisis plan, right? So how do we monitor, sort of who's responsible for it? And then just again, just kind of setting that planning process around the monitoring and detection of things. Because one thing that monitoring does is that it gives you that sort of that leg up on, if you're the first to maybe see something, a tweet or a message or a post, and then you have your plan in place and you sort of understand how to respond. It goes back to that point of the response time, right? So if someone posts something and your response is, yeah, I can address that, give me a call, or yeah, that's not what, here's what happened, or whatever, the more you can do that in a timely fashion, it eliminates that drawing of conclusions from the audience, right? Internal communication. So it's really important. We kind of been focusing on that external and the audience and stuff like that, but a lot of times things, when we're talking about internal, or especially in crisis situations and planning, is that your staff or your stakeholders, whoever, they're people too. They know, they see things, they read things, they hear things, right? So how do we communicate internally with, during certain situations? So 9 times out of 10, before you send anything public, you should be sending that same message, or a sort of a revised version of the message to your staff internally, and saying, hey guys, this is what's happening, this is the situation, this is how we're handling it. Again, no different than sort of how your public message, but sort of internally, these are the steps we're taking. If media calls, this is who you direct it to, things like that, right? And this is sort of once we've established that this issue is a crisis. So what does that look like? So just again, outlining and sort of understanding how we communicating with employees, the timeliness of that. And then also it's guiding the staff. How do they respond if they get that question, right? What happens if, let's say the scenario, it's more of a reputational thing. Well, how do you rebuild from that? What if there's a question, it's like, yeah, I saw you guys had this huge issue a couple months ago. What's going on? Like that could be a conversation in a potential sale, right? So what is the messaging? So it's always good to understand that even it's not always during the crisis, there's a component of kind of after, and what are we doing after that as well. And the more you can sort of internally communicate that to your staff and whomever, it goes a long way. So that really dovetails nicely into the stakeholder side. So when we're talking about communications, and you might obviously have this list and have a good idea of who your audiences are, but who do we need to tell, right? If there's certain situations or scenarios. So identify those groups. So maybe it's customers, suppliers, regulatory, who knows, maybe there's a regulatory body or component that you might need to work with. If it's more of a criminal thing, how do we, navigate those agencies as well? And then you really want to look at the developing the message and strategies for each group. So sometimes the message might work for all, but I shouldn't say 9 times, but a good chunk of that time, there's other groups that may need to know certain things that others don't, or there's different sort of level of detail when we talk about sharing information, right? So it's about understanding, well, does this group need to know that much? Yes, they do. Well, does this group need to know that much? Well, maybe not. So what does that message look like? Who needs to know what? Now, I know this might sound like a lot, and it's a lot of like trying to get things down on paper and, planning and writing all these messages. But if anything, if you take anything from today, it's just about getting in that mind of, even if it's just one page, what do we need to have, right? And if you're feeling really ambitious and you want to build out your huge plan, that's awesome too. But it's really about just identifying these things. And this really goes well into these last 2 points, is that you have to be flexible and adaptable to these types of situations and scenarios, because each thing is unique. As much as I keep saying planning, 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 it's not if, it's when, blah, blah, blah. There's things that will come up that will leave you like, we did all this planning and we still don't have that. So the more you sort of get in this exercise of writing things down or keeping track of things, you can add those scenarios throughout the year to your plan, right? Or throughout whatever time frame you've kind of set aside for this type of work. So when we build that flexibility into the plan, it helps you evolve. It helps the plan grow. One thing that I've seen organizations and individuals, sort of a mistake they make, is that they put together this great plan and then they never look at it again, ever. It only comes out when scenarios maybe arise, and let's say you don't have anything that's really warranted looking at that binder for 2 years. So you pull it out and you're like, oh my God, nothing's in here. This person doesn't even work here anymore. Like stuff like that. So it's always about, understanding, when you're looking at these plans, you have to adapt. They have to be sort of flexible documents as well. And then one thing to really add when we're looking at the planning, and you can include this in the overall crisis plan, or you can even just maybe have a separate debrief meeting, depending on the scenario, is that really look at the review of the situation of what happened. So how was our response? Did we get that information out in a timely manner? Was the fact that we didn't get it out in a timely manner, did that create the scenario or the crisis? What are areas that we need to improve upon? You know, is maybe we identified that our owner or manager does all media interviews. Well, does that make sense? Because maybe there was someone who maybe could have known or knows more about the details of this, that could have done it, right? So it's about identifying those strengths and areas for improvement, using sort of the knowledge you gained from a certain scenario to update and really just make the plan and your response even more effective. So a well-developed plan, whether it's 1 page or 200 pages, whatever, it serves as that tool to guide the organization or the dealer through a challenging time, whatever that may be. So what that does, if you have that plan, it helps not only maintain trust with your community and your audiences and stakeholders or whoever, it helps to maintain that trust with yourself too, right? So you're trusting yourself to say, we can handle these scenarios in the event they pop up. So the trust is a huge one. Again, it minimizes the impact or damages, and it just allows you to recover more effectively from certain situations. So when we look at sort of taking all that in, okay, so we've identified the scenarios, we've identified what crisis communications is, we identified what a plan should have, what will it do? So when we have sort of this understanding of a strong, okay, we have our plan, whatever it may be, this is what it's going to do. So the whole idea, and it's sort of listed in a few bullet points here, is the importance of having this plan is it's really about disseminating information, critical information in a timely fashion. So getting it out there, in a prompt manner to whomever that may be, if it's internal, external, media, social media, stakeholders, whatever it is. Just how are we doing that, and what is their time around that? It's about the protection of people and property. So when I say people and property, that's more of people in terms of you, maybe as the owner or the operator or the manager, and then your staff. If it's a community, if maybe there's something that's happened that has impacted your team, what does that look like? How are we helping these people, helping staff? And then property is your business, right? It could be physical property if that's the scenario you're faced, or just the the livelihood of your business, right? And then a biggest one and a huge thing that this doesn't just go across in crisis comms, this is just a general rule of thumb for communication in general, is transparency. So the more you can be transparent to your audience, your internal audience and external, the better it serves for the long run. So if not saying that you have to, everything is an open book and you share everything, because let's face it, honestly, there's information that needs to be private for a number of different reasons. So when I say transparency, it's not about sharing everything, but it's about thinking about, okay, well, what are the risks if we don't say this, or if we do say this, what are the risks? So what can we share? What do people want to know? Because sometimes when we're talking about crisis situations, sometimes they evolve just from a simple question, right? Someone might have a question or they post something, and if your sort of company line is we don't respond to that, or we'll just, it's not true, we're not going to respond. Again, it goes back to that people are drawing their own conclusions. So maybe it's like, okay, we will respond and this is how we say it, and we're being transparent, and you're mitigating these scenarios, right? Because sometimes the silence is not always golden in situations like this. Sometimes people want you to communicate, and it's just the whole purpose of like even webinars or seminars like this is understanding, well, what are we going to say and how are we going to say it, right? And if you go deeper, that's when you work with agencies or guys like me in media communications departments, and they guide you along the way of what to say and how to say it, right? So the biggest thing too, or one of the biggest things, is prioritizing sort of the impact of certain situations. Depending on the scenario, you really need to understand, okay, well, who is actually impacted here? Is it us as a company? Are we the ones who are at the top of this is going to impact us huge? This could be more in maybe data breach scenarios where your maybe your financial um, livelihood is at risk. Maybe someone, sometimes we hear ransomware attacks where they demand a certain amount of money to get you access back to your information. That's one scenario. Or maybe the crisis is that there was, customers that were impacted. Well, what does that mean to them? How are they feeling? So you really have to prioritize that sort of understanding that, and it's almost like you have to put that empathy hat on, right? Well, how are these people reacting and feeling? In some examples that we've seen is that people don't think like that. They always think, well, this is going to ruin my business, my day. It's terrible for me. And then that's the message they're getting out there. And then say, well, what about these 2,500 people that are impacted? You didn't mention anything. And that's a worst case scenario thing, but you know what I mean? Like if you are not identifying or thinking about how it might impact others, it might again create that scenario or build out that crisis even more so. And then what it does when we're looking at the communications planning and the crisis comm side is that don't say things that you should always sort of have an idea when you have the plan, is that things might, like I said, things might come up. You can't be prepared for everything, but ensuring that you have something that's planned, and you might know how to adapt and react to certain situations, it goes a long way. And then at the end of the day, control the narrative. You are in control of what you want to say and how you want to say it, and correct misinformation, especially when we're talking about negative press or negative messaging or negative feelings amongst customers. You can't control the way they feel, but you can control what you say. And then the goal is to, when they're looking at what you're saying and how you're saying it, and it goes even all the way down to the timeliness of that's can change the way they feel, right? If they say, wow, they responded to that in an hour or within a day, depending on the scenario, it could be positive, right? Whereas if you flip it, they took a friggin' week to get back to me on this, and all they said was that. Like, that is negative, right? It impacts that in a way that can almost like build upon these feelings maybe that people already have about you or your organization. So it's always good to control that, and ways it's not always in what you say, it's how you say it, when you say it as well. So this sort of really just summarizes ideas of, if we're putting in the time now, it really can mitigate these crisis scenarios in the future, right? Not saying you put your plan together and it's never going to happen. It's just you're better prepared to identify these and be ready to handle certain situations. So if you're not prepared for the crisis, it will drain a significant amount of resources during the situation, right? So just think about it. If you didn't have your stuff written ahead of time, you have to do that now, or you have to put things in place. You need to create, okay, well, who's handling this? And you're building it on the fly. So it really kind of sucks the resources and the time out of that. So it's best to take those steps to understand and act on the situation, and you can always tie back to your values as an organization as well. How do we handle these situations? So when you're doing that, sort of those key points, I'm not going to run through all of them, but I'll just quickly mention, like, identifying the risks, investing in communications planning, learning from community, researching the feedback, seeing what they're actually saying, listening, that goes back into that learning, and then inspire, right? But what I mean by inspire is that find out what kind of is the community trigger, right? Like, so what would really tick them off, and what would really what would create maybe that crisis type scenario, and how do we maybe avoid it, or what do we do if we're kind of treading down that path, right? And then communicate. How are we keeping community engaged, informed, not only during a crisis, but in general? And that kind of goes back to a few of my other presentations around, having an effective website and utilizing communications and social and stuff like that. So I can't stress it enough that this whole thing and this whole sort of idea around crisis communications planning is about being prepared. So what does that mean? Why does it matter? So these 3 points are crucial. What it does is it mitigates the damage of potential scenarios. It helps preserve your reputation, and then it demonstrates that you're, depending on the situation, you're taking responsibility, or you're informing, or you're answering, or you're with the community in these ideas of, if someone has a certain idea about your situation or your company, well, then how are we working with them, right? So when we talk about sort of the importance of being prepared and putting together a plan, what are some strategies around that? So some of the ideas around, now we're kind of getting to the world where we have our plan. Let's say it's a one pager, we have it ready to go. How we kind of constantly, what are we doing to keep this top of mind? So not just doing it, putting it on a shelf, never looking at it. What can we do? So early detection, immediate action, and proactive are the 3 sort of points that I like to leverage when we're talking about strategies for not responding per se to a crisis, but even just keeping a potential crisis maybe at bay. So monitoring of your social media and news, and then just having those as referenced in the plan. What is that? What are the mechanisms for who needs to know what, and stuff like that? So let's say the crisis hits, what's the action? So we activate the plan, open it up. It should be John does this, Susan does that, and then you're sort of following it and guiding it as you go along. Proactiveness, when we're talking about crisis comms, is really about that idea around the pre-work around statements and messaging, right? Pre sort of written stuff, aside from those critical details that we'll add. But the more you can sort of have that kind of in the bag or in the can ahead of time, it goes a long way. And it's no different, even if you kind of flip it and you say, sometimes maybe in sales, you're not writing, and sometimes you're writing maybe a sales email or outreach directly, but sometimes there's templates or things you can pull from other messages to fit into that. So crisis scenarios are no different. So it's really about pre-planning and having those those messages kind of ready for your usage, sort of at your fingertips. So to kind of wrap it up, and sort of we'll kind of go through a potential real world scenario, and then maybe we can get some questions around it, or even questions around the process of the crisis planning. But this is just a good way to kind of wrap it up within the next sort of 15 minutes of our chat here. Is so this scenario could be, maybe there's and this kind of goes, there's a few different things at play, because obviously maybe the manufacturer would be the one to mainly handle this, but the first, again, put your customer hat on. They bought that product from you. They're going to go to you if there's maybe a defect or something safety wise. So how do we handle that? So this is just a mock idea scenario. So what do we, this is out there, right? So this is happening. How do we handle this? So when we look at sort of the idea of, okay, this is our scenario, the defect is discovered, there's these are sort of the steps that are kind of playing out in the life cycle of this crisis. So maybe a third party or investigation revealed that there's a flaw in this model that's widely sold, and you happen to sell that. What are we doing? So sort of that's the understanding of the defect in the discovery. So maybe the next step of sort of that regulatory is maybe that, okay, the administrating body is recalling that, and it has to be this product or whatever it may be is no longer safe. We have to pull it. So what does that look like? And then sort of the third point is media got a hold of this now. So now it's, oh my gosh, everyone who has this model, maybe this make and model, it's recalled. What do we do? Because essentially the media's audience is your audience as well. They're looking for answers. So the news of this recall spreads through traditional media, social channels. There's concerned customers. Maybe you're getting phone calls. It's a safety issue. How do we handle this, right? What are we going to do? So as I mentioned before, this is sort of one where there's different impacts depending on who is actually, calling for the recall or whatever. But there's your reputation is still at stake. As I mentioned before, there's customers that, you are that only point of contact. So they may be questioning, well, the safety and reliability of products you're selling. Maybe they're just unloading on you now, right? Like, so you just have to be mindful of that as well. So impact on reputation could be seen in negative reviews, social media. It could be like sometimes it's misinformed opinions where they say, how could X RV dealership even let this happen? Well, how are they selling unsafe things? So it's just about understanding, okay, how are we handling these messages? So if we go back to you have your plan, you're ready to go. You're seeing this, the person doing your social has brought it to your attention. You open up your spiffy crisis communications plan, and what do? Well, immediate response. You activate the plan, your sort of your crisis team or whoever, however you have that set up is activated. You've designated your spokesperson, you're communicating based on the information that you have. That's sort of your first step. And again, the transparent, maybe you're providing clear and transparent information about the nature of the defect as you know it, as communicated to you, and the steps that you are taking. Maybe you're, come down, drop it off, or we'll come pick it up, whatever that may be. How are we addressing this situation? And then the third point here, so you have that message, that's the media message out there. This is your plan on how you're handling it. Customer outreach, how do we handle that? Again, this goes back to that, do we email? Do we call directly? Do we even have that information? How are we doing this? How are we connecting with those affected customers? What are we saying? Their biggest thing would be, okay, what do I do? So maybe you provide the steps on what they should do. What this does is it's a long game way of thinking. So if you're there with them, let's say this scenario is happening, you're building that trust, right? So they're saying, hey, this recall, it's not a big deal. They handled it. They're with me. They're helping. Whereas if you didn't have the plan and you're kind of running around, they could say, they didn't even call me, and they had no problem taking my money when I bought it. So what's happening, right? So the more you can kind of understand and plan for this stuff, it goes a long way in that end game as well. Obviously, if there's regulatory compliance, with authorities, there's a lot of moving pieces at this, and I'm not speeding through this. It's more so just for timing purposes, but sometimes you are at the mercy of the information that you have. You might be in the dark in certain situations as well. So it's just about understanding that's a very real situation, but how do we communicate that to our customers, right? Maybe you are waiting, or maybe a way you could do that is that, listen, we take this recall is out there, we take your concerns seriously. We're working with the manufacturer. We'll provide you an update, again, based on the timeline, whenever that may be. But if you even getting that information is better than nothing, better than silence. So when we're talking about sort of, let's fast forward, the recall's done, we've handled our situation. Maybe it didn't go as great as we sort of planned. What are the next steps? So how do we recover? How do we rebuild trust? Maybe there's this little inkling now around safety concerns, around certain models, around maybe certain things. How do we take that information and maybe put potential customers' minds at ease a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever that may be? So that could be a message that you've pre-written. So what are we saying to that person who maybe brings up that recall when it's said and done? How do we handle that? It's about thinking that long-term game, those long-term strategies of rebuilding that customer trust. And then sometimes you think, wow, that wasn't even our problem. It wasn't we didn't build the thing. It wasn't our defect. Why are we being impacted? Well, in the eyes of the public, you are that person. So sometimes it's not good enough to say, well, I'm going to wash my hands clean of it, let them deal with it. It's how do we handle it? Even just if you're thinking selfishly for the livelihood of your dealership, right? Your dealer, how even you as an individual, right?
Great. Thank you, Drew, for that presentation. You definitely covered a lot of points to outline the importance of not only having a plan, but how being proactive can help you better deal with the situation as they come up.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, it's hard to
so
cram a
just
lot of this into an hour, but I'm there's
yeah,
again always open to further conversations, and I can even share additional resources. And even Anita and I were talking earlier about how do we, build upon these things. So yeah, awesome. So the next topic that we're going to be doing is sort of around how do we leverage media to achieve in the realm of sales, right? So how do we use media to help tell our story? And when I say media, it's not paid media. It's more of that, not advertising component, but storytelling. So how do we leverage, if we do a weekly column, or how can we leverage media to help improve our sales, or even just your general reputation? And I see the link is in the chat now to register. So awesome.
that session will be on November 15th. Okay. I thank you, Drew, for and everybody for your time today. And so if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to Drew or myself. And I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you.